Okay, welcome everybody. I'm going to let you have a few more minutes to finish your food, and please feel free to get up and get more if you need to use the restrooms. It's right out this back door to my left, your right. But I wanted to make sure you saw all the goodies in the back, so those are for you to take. Think about upcoming birthdays or just weekend fun with your family, whatever you need. But I promise you, there's about 4 times that much in our trailer in storage, and so you're doing us a favor if you take it. So don't be shy. Grab a few things. Grab a whole bunch of things. It's there for you. We also are going to have, I think we have some meals to give out tonight. And then we also had a family donate some beef. So don't leave empty handed tonight. There's lots of different things to hand out. If you didn't get a chance to yet and you need relicensing hours, there's a sign-in sheet directly out those center doors to the left on a table there. So if you haven't written your family's name down yet and you need a certificate of attendance for tonight's training, make sure you get your name on that list. And then at the end of the night, you can pick up your certificate at that same table. So we're going to get started here about 6:30. But in the meantime, make yourself at home, enjoy your food, and hanging out with each other. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started with our gathering for tonight. And I want to welcome those of you that are here in person, but also our live stream audience. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm really excited about the content that we have to share with you tonight. I think it's super relevant as we dig in relationally with each other and we hear about the things that are going on with our kids and in our families. And excited to have a couple of well-qualified women from All Star Children's Foundation to share with us tonight, and just to kind of lean into their wisdom and their training. But first, I want to let you know about a couple of exciting opportunities. So I had the chance to have a call with the Florida Sheriff's Youth Ranch a couple of weeks ago, and just gain an understanding of the programs that they offer, including free summer camp. They have an overnight camp. It's 8 days. It's completely free. I'm going to send you all of the dates and all of the details in a follow-up email tonight once our gathering is over. But in addition to their overnight camp, they also offer 2 mobile camps that are coming to Manatee County this summer. And so I'll share those dates and details with you as well. But what really impressed me was that the Florida Sheriff's Youth Ranch recently sent 12 of their employees to become TBRI practitioners. And so we love that the content that they're sharing and the way that they're doing camp and the model that they're following. If you've been around Bridge Life for very long at all, you know that we believe so much in trust-based relational intervention. So to know that they have 12 now professionals on their campuses who are TBRI trained, they're meeting monthly to talk about how do we weave TBRI into what we're doing at the Florida Sheriff's Youth Ranch and into their camps specifically. So be on the lookout for that email with all of those details. And if you have additional questions after that, you can reach out to me and I'll put you in contact with Alicia, who is our contact there at the Florida Sheriff's Youth Ranch. Those of you that maybe you just come to the gathering and you're not sure what else Bridge of Life does, and so we want to do just a little bit of a program overview before we get started tonight. Ladies, every single month on the first Friday of the month, we host a ladies' night out, and we would love to see you there. It's just a casual gathering of women who are foster and adoptive parents or maybe relative and non-relative caregivers. We get together at a different restaurant on the first Friday of each month, usually alternating between Sarasota and Bradenton. And it's just a great group of ladies to lean into, to do kind of a girls' night, to have a fun dinner together, but also to just know that you're surrounded by people who are walking a similar journey as you are, and women who are a wealth of knowledge to be able to lean into. And so that's a really great way just to get resources as well. So women, we would love to see you ladies' night out. We also host, we partner with different churches throughout the community to host parents' night out events, which is basically 3 or 4 hours of free childcare. So if you go to our website, it's bridgealife.com, and you click on our events drop down, there's a calendar, and you can see which churches are hosting those and where they are and the times and locations. Ray, I did just get a text that said something about maybe the live stream hadn't started yet, if you could just kind of confirm that. The other thing that we offer are hammer time projects. So if you have a home improvement project, and it can be just like, hey, my yard needs to be mowed, or I'm moving in siblings and we need bunk beds put together, we have a variety of volunteers with different skill sets. And so you can go onto our website and you can request a home improvement project, and we'll see if we have some volunteers who match the needs in your home, and we would love to be able to come out and help you with that. Same with meals. If you get a new placement or you're having a particularly hectic week, you can always reach out to us. We have freezer meals that are on hand, and we have volunteers throughout the community who are happy to deliver those to you. And then we also offer one-time financial assistance of up to $1,000, as well as small adoption grants. So if you find yourself in a precarious situation with finances and you know you have a sustainable option, but you just need a little bit of help getting to that place, you can always put in a request online. We'll review that, and then we like to be able to help families. Particularly, we've noticed like when you first take a placement and maybe the subsidy hasn't kicked in yet, or something unexpected happens with a car or a home improvement project, those kinds of things. So we want to be able to just wrap around your family in a variety of ways. And so if you haven't made yourself familiar with our website, it's bridgealife.com. you'll see a drop down that says how we help families, and then it lists all those programs that I just talked about. So we'd love to see you more than just at the gathering, and we want to be able to hear from you too to know how we can help your family. We also want to let you know of an opportunity coming up. How many of you have heard of the Giving Challenge before? Okay, a few of you, great. So our community foundations in the area, they do an amazing job of training nonprofits and how to be successful and giving us opportunities to really leverage the generosity of our community. So on April 26th and 27th, there is a matching gift opportunity. And so if you want to be able to help us continue to offer Bridge Life programs free of charge to families, during that 24-hour time period, your gift of $25 to $100 will be matched. Which means it'll be doubled, which is an amazing opportunity just to be able for us to reach more families. So I'll include that in the email as well. If that's something that you're interested in, you can just click the link, and we're even happy to send you like a reminder during those 24 hours with a giving link, so it's super easy. Okay, I'm going to introduce our speakers tonight. Chelsea and Mary are with us from All Star Children's Foundation. I'm so excited about what they have to share just with some de-escalation strategies and calming big behaviors, something that we're all familiar with, right? And so we want to be able to just learn from them. They're going to give you an opportunity to ask questions. So as interactive as we need this to be to benefit you, we definitely want to meet your family where you're at, whether you're parenting little ones or you have teenagers in your home. So thanks so much for being here with us tonight, and we're going to go ahead and have you come on up.
Hi, I'm Chelsea Hernandez. I am the clinical director at All Star Children's Foundation. And this is Mary Bain Stevens. She's one of our clinical counselors as well at All Star Children's Foundation. So I'm not sure if anybody has had a chance to drive by our facility. We're located in Sarasota off of 17th Street and Lockwood Ridge area. We're fairly new. We consider ourselves a startup. We've only been going for a couple years. And we are a pediatric mental health and research facility who also has a 5-acre plot of land with our own community of foster homes behind our research facility. So our foster homes, we have 6 foster homes, individually licensed foster homes that can hold up to 5 children. And within these homes, our facility, our clinical facility and enrichment facility, provide wraparound services for foster families and children placed in the homes. Our homes hold children ages 0 to 17, and like I said, are licensed to hold up to 5 kids. So additionally, with clinical services, we also provide quite a bit of training. So we gave everybody, and if you don't have a folder and you would like one, we didn't have quite enough for every single seat. So feel free, if you need more brochures or copies, you can take some more from some of the other tables. But one of the things we also offer our foster families on our campus and also within the community is foster parent training. So you'll see one of the flyers we have. We will be doing a training coming up in June for some of our foster families on site and also for the community called Resource Parenting Curriculum, which is a curriculum off of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, NCTSN. That goes through a lot of trauma education, as well as helping you kind of navigate systems, advocacy for your children, and understanding trauma-informed treatment and evidence-based practices. So that's a 16-hour course, typically that we do for 8 weeks for 2-hour sessions. So if you are interested, I would be the contact person, and my email is listed at the bottom of that brochure. We'd love to have you join. We typically would only have between 10 to 15 families per session. So slots will fill. If you are interested, I would encourage you to reach out. So with that being said, a little intro to All-Star. Today, we will be talking about de-escalation and crisis management strategies. So as Jody and I were kind of processing what would be most helpful for you all today, this topic came up. And, you know, I would imagine you all have different kiddos in your homes and have seen different things over the years and kind of managing different behaviors. So today our hope is to really kind of dive into what de-escalation looks like and different strategies that you guys can take home today to kind of work with some of your kids as they're escalating or maybe having difficult behaviors that you're trying to help manage. So we'll go through a little bit. I think I have to grab this.
We didn't think about our technology here, so we'll get there.
Perfect. So to kind of give you an overview of what we'll be focusing on today, we'll spend just a little bit of time on some of the background information. So when we jump into de-escalation and calming big behaviors and crisis management, we always want to kind of go into it with a little bit of a foundation on how do you understand how to manage, big behaviors. Jody says probably you guys have had a good amount of education and understanding on brain development and on trauma. Over the last 10 years, we've had a big push in a lot of different trainings, a lot of different programs moving towards becoming more trauma informed and helping people understand what is trauma, how does it impact our children, and how does it impact the way in which our children respond. And that includes the way in which our brain functions when it goes through trauma. So we'll go through that, brain development, and then trauma in the brain. And then we'll finish off with some de-escalation techniques and then also crisis management. And our hope is if we have some time at the end that we would love to kind of talk through some scenarios that maybe you guys are encountering and different ways that we as clinicians would maybe suggest different ways to respond or kind of step back and look in those situations a little bit differently. So with that being said, I'm going to transition to Mary Bain, and she's going to start us off with the first couple topics.
You going to do the slides for me, or do you want me to? Okay. So I'm going to kind of start with information that you've probably heard before. So we're going to power through this fairly quickly and talking about what trauma is, how the brain functions, how trauma physically affects the brain. So we'll get started with that. Like we said, if you have questions, please feel free, and we'll go from there. But our slide here, without understanding the basic principles of how the brain develops and changes, we cannot expect to design and implement effective interventions. So what we're saying is that our brain drives everything that we do, and we need to understand how it works under normal circumstances to understand the effects of trauma and also how to intervene with our children's big behaviors. And I've learned that sometimes once you understand why a child might be behaving the way they are, it's a lot easier to cope with that behavior when you realize it's not personally directed at you. There are brain systems and functions that's going on that are not personal. So that kind of helps, I think. So brain development. We're going to start by looking at the basics of brain development. And like I said, before we understand how trauma affects the brain, we need to understand kind of the structure and design and functioning of the human brain. So this is a picture of learning as it happens in the brain. And as you see, it starts on the left with a few connections, more and more and more as things go across. And what you're going to see is how much we can affect that in positive ways with children. So just for a little bit of science here, we all know a neuron is a nerve cell that's electrically excitable. It communicates with the other cells through structures called synapses, and these are specialized connections in the brain. So what you see going across as things get more and more tangled is more synapses are growing, more connections are being made. Neurons are our building blocks of learning. They're different shapes and sizes, and a mature brain has about 86 billion neurons. And you can kind of see in looking at that picture, neurons have two ends, one for receiving and one for sending information. And they make connections with each other to pass that information along. So learning happens when these connections are repeated and then they broaden to other areas, and these connections develop networks of interconnections, as you can see with our pictures there. And information travels faster the more connections there are. And so, like I said, this is a scan of learning taking place in the human brain. And the cool thing is you're going to find out how much you can affect that with your kids. So neurons, like we said, neurons we've explained, and neurons that fire together wire together. That means as much as the more communication that's going on in the neurons in your brain, the more connections and increased functioning you see. So, and the more you do a thing, the more likely you are to repeat it. So there was a Canadian neurologist named Donald Hebb who conducted early studies of how the brain and neurons worked. And he said, neurons that fire together wire together, which means that neurons or parts of the brain that are affected at the same time fire at the same time and become wired together. They become linked together so that when one fires, the other associated neurons fire. And so if you see in actual pictures of the brain, sometimes you'll see, and they've colored them or whatever, you see a thing start on one side and go whoosh across the brain as those connections, as the message is riding those connections in the brain structures. So again, the more likely you do something, the more likely you are to repeat it, because your brain has been wired for that type of response. And we know this from learning a new song, a new hobby, anything new. Learning how to do math, the more you do it, the better you are, and it is a function of your growing brain structures that make that happen. So learning is, there are kind of three basic aspects of learning. So learning is acquiring new or modifying current knowledge, skills, or behaviors. That's 1 and 2. And that's pretty straightforward. But when we're talking about trauma, and we'll start to get into trauma a little bit now, when we're talking about how traumatic experiences wire together in neural pathways, the third of these points is the most relevant to the discussion of trauma. As we've said, learning occurs when exposure is repeated, powerful, and is reinforced. So if you think about trauma, and it would be easier to raise your hand with the kids that you have who've not been through traumatic experiences, right? Because every one of you who has children who have been in foster care, these kids have been through trauma. And probably most of us in this room have had some traumatic experience in our lives. And so the trauma experiences wire together in the brain, just like we've talked about with the connections, those neural connections that wire together. Those traumatic experiences wire together in neural pathways. And so that's why trauma can become magnified. And, like I said, please feel free to ask questions whenever you want to. So a trauma response is really a learned neurological habit. And so we all know if you have a habit, you can break a habit. If anybody's tried to quit smoking and been successful, or tried to cut out sugar from their diet and been successful, you know you can break a habit. You can break a trauma response habit also. And so our trauma, this neurological habit is the way our brain has wired itself in response to the trauma-triggered situations. And it's really strong. And this response is so much stronger than many others because the trauma response is related to survival. When someone has been through a traumatic event, we truly believe when we go through a traumatic event that our survival is at stake. And so that makes those connections that much stronger. So, got a couple of basic functions of the brain. So let's review a little bit about how trauma impacts brain development and functioning. So, what is trauma? And I'm sure that you have all had some sort of trauma training. And so some of this is, probably a lot of this is going to be a review, but I want you to think of it in terms of what we've just talked about, that our trauma responses are very much a function of how brains wire themselves and how brains develop. And then when you're thinking of trauma in children, if you think about those connections and how neural connections increase, that trauma response, that trauma connection can be so much stronger because there are fewer of the other connections floating around yet. So our kids do have a hard time with their traumatic experiences. So in general, trauma is an event that but the traumatic event, it tends to be sudden, unpredictable, and it involves a perceived threat to life. And it's beyond that person's control. Those are the hallmarks of a traumatic event. So that for our children that come from hard places and hard lives, their experiences of trauma may have been neglect, abuse, separation from family, impaired caregiving. You know the gamut of these experiences these kids have. And when you think about it, young children rely on adults for everything, including food, shelter, comfort, safety. And so experiences of abuse and neglect to them are threatened death and serious injury in many cases. If mom doesn't feed me, I will starve and die. And that is a traumatic cycle. So some of the examples that our children may have experienced include physical or sexual abuse, abandonment, neglect, death or loss of a loved one, witnessing domestic violence, caregiver substance abuse, community violence, terrorism, natural disasters, auto accidents, what have you. And I bet you can sit here and think of all the children that you have fostered and tick them off. Yes, yes, yes. These children have done this, had this, and this, and this. So, like we said, trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event. And so there are three types of trauma. The first is acute. So that's a single event, like a car wreck, a plane crash, a serious accident. Then there's chronic, which is repeated and prolonged trauma, like domestic violence or abuse. And then there's complex trauma, which is a combination of all of it. It's varied and multiple. And complex trauma, it involves both acute and chronic, and it often is invasive and interpersonal. So you think about sexual abuse, physical abuse, those can become the complex traumas. So our kids have a lot going on in their brains because of their trauma experiences. So here's some really upsetting numbers. We're looking here at statistics released by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and these are the most recent statistics that we could find. So during fiscal year 2017, Child Protective Services received an estimated 4.1 million referrals involving 75 million children. Now, those are reported incidents of abuse and neglect. Who knows how many others there really were. Then 674,000 children were found to be victims of at least one report of child abuse or neglect. And you can see they're aggregated at 74.9, so 75% of the child abuse cases were neglect. 18% were physical abuse. Almost 9% of those involved sexual abuse, and 7% were psychological abuse. So of reported cases, these are the ones that were founded. Yes, ma'am. Sir, I'm sorry. I have bad eyes. You're very much a sir. United States. So the worst is the last bullet. 1,720 children died from neglect and or abuse. So the numbers are huge, and the numbers are made real in your homes right now. So we're going to look at a video, and so our wizard behind the screen is going to take care of that for us, and then we'll talk about it. This is Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who is a psychiatrist and researcher specializing in trauma and the brain, and he's going to talk about how trauma impacts the brain.
survivor, it can feel like the whole world has changed. Life in general often seems scarier and more menacing at every turn, because when trauma occurs, the brain changes. In fact, there are 3 key differences between the brain of someone who suffers from PTSD and the brain of someone who does not, according to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk.
One is that the threat perception system is enhanced, so that people see danger where other people see manageable stuff. And this is not in the cognitive part of the brain, this is sort of the core perceptual part, the very primitive part of the brain. So the primitive part of the brain that basically is in charge of making sure that your body is okay becomes a fear-driven brain. So that's number one. Number two is that your filtering system, a little higher up in your brain, that helps you to distinguish between what is relevant right now and what you can dismiss, gets messed up. So things that other people may sort of ignore or not pay attention to, you start paying attention to it, which makes it very hard to focus on what's going on right now. So you get into the whole issue of being difficult to fully engage with ordinary situations. The third one is that the self-sensing system, which runs through those midline structures of the brain that various people probably have talked about on your program already, that midline structure that's devoted to your experience of yourself gets blunted. And that's probably a defensive response, because when you are in a state of terror, you feel it in your body. You feel it in terms of heartache and gut-wrenching feelings, and so your body feels bad. And so as a way of coping with that, some people start taking drugs to sort of dampen that system, and other people sort of naturally find a way of dampening that internal response to yourself. But when you start dampening your response to yourself, you also dampen the response to pleasure, sensuality, excitement, connection, stuff like that. So it's very, very deep in the core organism of human beings.
With a deeper understanding of what's happening in the brain following a traumatic experience, we can apply more targeted interventions that can help patients heal.
We ready? Did it pop up? Looks like it's looking for a network. Ta-da. All right. So we're going to get real sciencey here for a minute with trauma and the developing brain. Am I good? Okay. So you see this picture that is really hard to understand, but we're going to look at 3 different structures. In red is the amygdala, and it is responsible for regulation of emotion, and it's the brain's alarm system. So then in blue is the hippocampus, and it takes care of memory and learning. And then green is the prefrontal cortex. So that's in charge of working memory, impulse control, and what we call executive functioning, which means the ability to plan and focus your attention, remember instructions, and manage multiple tasks. So think about how many of your kids have trouble with that, the executive functioning. So these three areas of the brain are the most affected by trauma, and it involves just about everything that we deal with. It's emotional regulation, memory, learning, attention, and executive function. So what happens is trauma overactivates the amygdala, and when the amygdala gets overactivated, it inhibits everything else, the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. So think about it. The amygdala is really one of the most primitive structures in the brain. Has anybody ever heard of the lizard brain? Well, it's kind of a way of thinking about the amygdala. That's a structure that every creature has that tells you when to run away because you're about to get eaten, or when to hide because there are hawks in the sky flying overhead that are going to get you. And in humans, it does the same thing. It's our fight or flight. It is our hide, get away, or and like I said, flight or fight, or to stand up and fight with whatever is threatening you. So if that amygdala is overstimulated, everything else stops. Those other processes can't happen. So when we're under stress or threat, the brain essentially says, react, do something, stay safe. That's the amygdala. So when our brains sense danger, our heart rate increases, sensory systems like hearing and vision become hyper alert because you might have to run away and hide, and all the other non-essential stuff is disengaged. So we focus on that reacting in the minute to save our lives. So if we believe we're in danger, we don't have time to access memories or learned experience or problem solving or evaluating options or planning. So the amygdala essentially prevents the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex from functioning the way they're designed to. So, think about anybody that you know, and I keep bringing it back to one of the kids that you know, when they're in a state and you try to talk to them about using their strategies, using their words, all those things, that part of their brain is shut down. And we're going to talk about how to deal with that a little bit. So it's not that they're being disrespectful or whatever. The parts of their brain that you want to be functioning can't right now. And so we have to get past that before we can go any further. So with this information, you see that trauma really changes the chemistry of the brain. And an amygdala that is overstimulated all the time just kind of stays rocking and rolling all the time. And it makes it that much harder then for children and adults with traumatic experiences to learn, like we said, to go to school. If you have a child who's having a hard time in school, it may not be ADHD. It could be trauma because it looks like those ADHD behaviors. So now we know a little bit about hopefully, by knowing a little bit about how the brain functions under trauma, we can tailor our responses when we're responding to our children's big behaviors. So, the first thing to do, obviously now I think it's made it pretty clear, your first job is to calm the amygdala. When our children are escalated, and how many have had an escalation this week? Okay, yeah. So when they're escalated, our first priority has to be calm the amygdala. Because the more escalated a person becomes, the less active the smart part of the brain, those parts that are responsible for processing speech and language, becomes, the more flattened those become. And over time, these escalations cause our brain to stay in the alarm brain state because of the brain's makeup. The amygdala has been overstimulated, and it's just working all the time. So if you want to help someone out, whether they're in a heightened state or not, make sure they feel safe, physically and psychologically, first. And Chelsea will give us some more about that in a minute. So that's job one, calm the amygdala. Job two is to build new neural pathways. And you've seen now, the brain takes care of that itself. We have to provide the routine, the activity, the words to create those neural pathways. So that's the good news. We can build new neural pathways, move away from the traumatic ones into more functioning ones. So by doing this, then we teach that person new ways of getting their needs met and of functioning. So when the brain is calm and the person feels safe, this produces the possibility for learning. Nobody learns if the amygdala is what's taken over. There's no learning to be done. So you can't even get to job 2 until you've done job 1. And then we're going to start building new neural pathways. And doing this, these bullets show you the really crucial ways that are going to help that happen. So relationships are a crucial component to a child's recovery from trauma. There's got to be a safe person in their life that they can talk to and feel safe with. And of course, that's you. Our trauma interventions that recognize that children need to feel safe and through a relationship, the interventions that recognize that and spend a lot of time with caregivers and children together and caregivers alone and work on building up a positive relationship tend to work the best. So it is essential that children feel safe in their relationships with caregivers so the brains can get out of survival mode and begin to focus on developing other areas that were previously neglected. So also important in the caregiver-child relationship is consistency and predictability in a caregiver's expectations. Children do better, and you know this, children do better when they have a clear understanding of rules and when there's a good degree of predictability and consistency in adult responses to them. The last thing you want is for a child who has been through trauma to have to always constantly come in and read the room to see what kind of responses they're going to expect today. They need to be the same every day. So as we previously mentioned, children with complex trauma histories have a difficult time communicating their wants, needs, and feelings effectively. A caregiver who attunes to a child and accurately reads their nonverbal and verbal cues and gets curious about a child's behavior is helping a child to develop some self-awareness and understanding of themselves. So it's us getting curious about them rather than reading the riot act over this difficult behavior that is going to make a difference. So that last bullet point is super, super important. Teach skills during neutral situations. Teaching does not work during a crisis. So it might help to think of it that way, that when you're in a crisis, the only job you have is to calm that down. It's not the time to teach. It's not the time to correct. You don't need to do anything else but calm that crisis. And then you go on when things are calmer to make those behavior changes. So now I think you're on.
Okay, so we got a very quick snapshot of the brain and then also trauma and the impacts trauma has on the brain. So now what do we do about it, right? How do we manage these big behaviors? So before crises reach this boiling point, right, there's a lot of things that we're going to encourage people to do ahead of time, to be really preventative, to do our absolute best to try to not let that situation escalate to the point of a boiling situation and having those big behaviors. So we know a little bit more about the brain. We know a little bit more about trauma and trauma's impacts on the brain. And now it's time to kind of apply some of that knowledge to these crisis situations. And so through all of the de-escalation strategies, we're really going to focus on prevention and intervention. So really kind of increasing that awareness. So I'm sure most of you are very familiar with warning signs. If any of your kiddos are in clinical services, I would hope this is something a clinician would be talking to you about. Identifying early warning signs. So talking about prevention, We know that the earlier we're able to intervene in a situation, the better the outcome will be. And so looking for signs of stress, triggers, warning signs is going to really set us up for success and being able to better manage a situation. These warning signs are going to be really important for you to kind of identify and know your children. And that might be challenging because some of you might have new children in your home. Children might come and go in your home frequently. And so it takes a little time to kind of get to know a kiddo and to be able to kind of identify, okay, this is when Johnny gets upset. He does X, Y, Z. And the case manager you're working with, maybe some other people that are associated with the child in your home, they might have some tips and tricks to help you recognize what those early warning signs are. But I would encourage you all to kind of identify, all right, what are the signs I need to be on the lookout for that help me understand when a crisis might be building. And these are just some examples. I think probably as you think about some of the children in your home, you might already be able to kind of recognize, oh yeah, I know when so-and-so does this, he's about to get really upset, or it's going to be a hard night if this happens. And so these are some just very typical things that we hear a lot of people talk about. So kind of the pacing, the clenching the fists, sweaty palms, agitation, not listening, some of those kinds of, the rocking back and forth. Some of those behaviors are good cues for you all as caregivers to recognize, okay, this is my time. I'm going to start intervening right now before the situation continues to escalate. So as you've kind of recognized the warning signs, you're thinking through all of the children in your house, you're able to kind of recognize what do those warning signs look like for my child. The next thing I would really encourage you to do in any situation that might potentially escalate is to really assess the situation, assess what's going on. And so we would encourage that in 3 different ways. So the first thing that we would say is, what's going on with you, right? How are you feeling? Do you feel capable of managing the situation? You might know exactly what this situation is going to look like if you don't intervene. You might have gone through this many times before. Do you feel like you have the energy to manage this situation? Do you need somebody to tap out? If maybe you've just kind of reached your breaking point today and you need a little bit of help. Knowing yourself and being able to reflect on what you feel capable of managing is really helpful and can kind of help you go into a situation feeling more prepared and ready to kind of manage and support your child. So we want to kind of encourage remaining calm, rational, when you're able to in every situation that you are addressing. And obviously that's easier said than done, right? You can kind of write it down or read it in a book, and then when you're in the midst of a situation, it can kind of feel like, throw the book right out the window. But I would say, if we're able to kind of regulate ourselves, then one, we're modeling for our children what regulation and affect modulation looks like, right? And then 2, there's research that shows that a calm state and responding to children in a calm state, produces better outcomes. I don't know if you've ever been yelled at when you're agitated or frustrated, but it doesn't often help the situation. It does the opposite. It tends to escalate the situation. I would also encourage positive affirmations towards yourself. So kind of comfort statements towards yourself saying like, all right, I got this. I can do this. This isn't my first rodeo. I have the tools in my tool kit here to know how to manage the situation. Going in it with that kind of a mindset too can kind of help set you up for success. So you're kind of assessing yourself. Now we want to assess the person, right? So the kiddo involved in your care. Do you know what happened? Do you know what set that child off? What was the trigger? Can you take a step back and just recognize, is it really about the piece of bubble gum, or was it something else? Was there something else leading up to this escalation point? So being able to kind of take that step back and recognizing the situation as a whole and digging a little bit deeper too might help you feel a little bit more empathetic towards your child, which then in turn could help you respond in a calmer state. To kind of think through what's happening. And then 3rd, assessing the environment. So I'm sure there's different areas in your house that you would probably prefer a child not to have an escalation. If there's, things that can be thrown or dangerous objects like knives in a kitchen, or you have other kiddos in your household, assessing the environment and trying to kind of determine, maybe with your partner or somebody else in your home, okay, can you get the other kids out of the room? I'm going to manage Johnny in this room tonight. And being able to kind of evaluate if you're out in Publix, right? You might be having to respond to a situation a little bit differently than you would if you were in your family room. And being able to take away the audience at times can be helpful. And so just really recognizing, okay, who's around you? What supports do you have in your home tonight to help you manage a situation? And, if you have somebody in your home, how can they help maybe wrangle or support you as you're managing maybe this potentially escalating situation? The next thing that we would encourage is empathy and a non-judgmental stance. So it's really important that our children feel heard and validated. We can do this by a number of different ways, and some of those are reflection. And, reflecting, paraphrasing is really just kind of saying back or interpreting maybe our child's behaviors to them out loud. Our children might not necessarily have the words to be able to express how they're feeling. And so as caregivers, it's our job to help them name those feelings and emotions and kind of recognize, oh, buddy, I see you're so frustrated right now. How can I help? And being able to just minimize the language that you use while also recognizing those emotions and kind of putting words to the situation. And you might be off, and there's been a lot of times where kids have been like, no, that's not how I feel. And then I maybe try to take another guess at how I'm interpreting that behavior. So the reflection and the paraphrasing helps the child feel heard and understood. And it shows them that you're actually listening and you're paying attention to them. That can actually be really helpful in situations. Whether we agree or not with how our children are feeling, that doesn't matter in a sense, right? Like those emotions to our children are so real and so valid in that moment that we want to be able to work with them in that situation. So, we might think in our heads sometimes like, oh, seriously, again with this attitude or with this emotional outburst, like nothing even happened. That response won't be very helpful in the situation, and it will turn to more escalation, right? It's going to just kind of invalidate that child's feelings, which then is going to amp up the behaviors. So no matter what we think, even if we're like, oh my gosh, again, if we take that step back and kind of recognize and approach it with a heart of empathy, right? And this non-judgmental stance, then our children are going to respond very differently to that. And so one thing that I like to kind of recognize too is, that moment that our children are engaged in this escalation behavior, that might be the most important thing in their life right now, right? And so for us to be able to recognize that, like, woof, this is a very important moment. And Mary Bain talked about that reinforcement in the brain, right? Those neural pathways. So the way in which we're responding, we're building those neural pathways for our children. So if we're responding in similar ways that potentially an abusive parent has responded to before, what we're doing is we're reinforcing those neural pathways, and we're not helping our children build new neural pathways to recognize, oh, there's different ways to respond in these escalating situations. I don't have to just get cursed at or yelled at or beaten. There's somebody that approaches me with like love and affection, and that turns into a very different outcome for our children as well. Another thing that we want to encourage is communication, clear communication, and safe communication. So we talked about the brain. We talked about how the brain responds under duress, right? And how it doesn't really process the same way when it's under duress. So we know, science has told us, that the brain is not going to be able to fully process what's going on, and our children are not going to be able to really express themselves in a moment of escalation, when they're agitated, when they're about to burst. So it's really hard to hear someone and fully grasp what someone is telling you or giving you directions when you're in this escalated state, right? So for us as caregivers, it might be like, oh my gosh, this kid is so disrespectful. They don't listen. Like, they keep putting themselves in these dangerous situations. when their brain, the part of the brain that actually processes speech, language, and interpretation, shuts down. It literally doesn't work. So their brain is only focused on that alarm brain, that amygdala part of the brain is fired and it's acting, right? And so for us to kind of say, oh, this kid's not listening when they're agitated, their brain really is not allowing them to listen. They really can't take those directions. And so coming at it from that perception, you kind of see the situation a little bit differently. And that's then where you're focusing on, okay, my number one goal is to keep this kid safe, right? Safety is my number one goal. And then when my child's at a safe state, then I can talk. And we can kind of go through the debriefing situation and talk back through, the situation that just happened, but not when my child's at that escalated peak. So all of that really kind of focuses then on that body language, the way in which we're interacting with our children, our facial expressions, our movements, our tone of voice. All of that is going to be interpreted from our children, because our children aren't hearing our words. They're only able to see kind of those body movements, those gestures. That part of the brain is still on, because that part of the brain is connected to that fight, flight, or freeze part of the brain, right? Our higher functioning part of the brain that interprets language doesn't work. So your words, you could be like, la, 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 and I wouldn't know what you're saying, but I see that you're happy with me and you're smiling. Or you could be annoyed with me and saying, I really hear what you're saying, but if I see your facial features are annoyed with me, then that's going to reinforce my fear of how you're maybe going to respond to me. I don't care what your words say. I see your behaviors and how you're interacting with me. So kind of recognizing that and the change that trauma does to the brain. Okay. So talking about communication, now this kind of transitions us into proxemics, which is really a fancy way of just saying distance, right? Social distance. We're all very familiar with social distance these last few years, right? So there's 4 different zones of distance, and you would probably be very familiar with all of them. So right now, you and I, we're in the public zone, right? So we're like about 12-ish feet apart, and this is really for people, strangers, right, that you don't really know. It'd be really weird if I was like sitting right at your table in your face talking to you. It feels more comfortable to have, people a little bit farther away in public zones. Then you have your social zones, so at your tables, right? You might be 4 to 12 feet apart if you're looking at maybe each table. And that's for like maybe people that you're not 100% familiar with, people that are coming into your house, workers in the community. Then you have your personal zone. So some of you are in some personal zones, right? So that's like 1.5 to 4 feet. And that's usually, something at social functions. So a party, a get-together, a community event like this. And then you have your intimate zones. So that's your 6 inches to your 8 inches. And that's really for people, that you have a strong affection to. So, maybe a spouse or a partner or a sibling, family member, somebody that you feel is allowed to enter into that personal zone. So those that we allow into this personal zone, it's really dependent on your relationship with that person, right? So you can probably know in your head, who would you allow this close to your face? Can kind of tell you who you would feel comfortable interacting that closely with. And so we want to make sure whenever we're thinking about space that we're recognizing these zones and kind of the comfort levels of the people around us, especially our children. And so for our kiddos that are maybe escalating, we want to recognize this space, right? And for a lot of our children that come from really challenging or traumatic backgrounds, getting into their space can be very triggering to them, especially if you might remind them of somebody that caused them trauma in the past. If your voice tone reminds them of somebody that has caused them trauma in the past. So all of the ways in which we're interacting, our personal space, the proxemics, can really kind of factor how our children are going to respond to us in that situation. So there's times to kind of assess, there's times to communicate, and there's also times to allow for silence. So we talked about reflection, and silence is actually a really good reflector as well. It's kind of silly. If anybody's ever been to therapy, there's times where clinicians will kind of allow us to sit in silence. And silence can kind of be uncomfortable at times, right? but it can also bring out a lot of conversation and a lot of dialogue. And so sometimes just sitting back and allowing our children to kind of just be present with their emotions and just letting them maybe reflect on their behavior could kind of help be a powerful communicator in and of itself. Another one is time for decision making. I know I'm a guilty culprit with my own children. I have 3 kids, and there's times I give command after command after command after command, and my children, don't listen to all of the commands in a row, and it's very frustrating. But I have to kind of take a step back as well and remember, just in general, giving commands, to allow our children the opportunity to respond to the command, right? So we would always kind of recommend the rule of 5. So allowing at least 5 seconds to pass before we give another command. So I literally in my head will count to 5 before I give another command, to try to give our children the opportunity for success, the opportunity to maybe respond to a command before we're just inundating them with command after command after command. And that kind of speaks into, again, as you're escalating and you're engaging in maybe more of these behaviors, it's going to be harder and harder for you to kind of think clearly when you're so upset. And so stress rises when people feel rushed, right? The more somebody's giving me a command, then the more stressed I'm going to get, the bigger my behavior might become. So one of the modalities of crisis intervention that we use at All Star Children's Foundation is UCARU, which is a crisis management and de-escalation training. And part of UCARU, they have a philosophy of comfort versus control. In big situations, when you're trying to get your children to respond, when you're trying to help manage a potentially dangerous situation, it feels really easy to fall into these control patterns, right? Like we want our children to stop acting out, to manage their behaviors, and to be safe. And that doesn't always happen very easily, right? We've tried to kind of dive in a little bit more into the brain to try to understand how that all works, and it's kind of confusing and hard, and in the moment we just kind of want it to stop. But through a lot of research, we've realized that control doesn't really work, and it doesn't really help calm situations down. And so shifting away from a control stance to a stance of more comfort can be really helpful in being able to manage situations. And so it's often easier said than done, right, to be able to kind of practice a comforting approach. But these are some of the suggestions that would kind of tie into this comfort instead of this controlling approach. So the first one would be flexibility, right? So when we're looking at a situation, what are we okay with not dealing with, right? Like what are the junk behaviors that we can say, ooh, I don't really like that, but it's okay to just maybe let go for right now. Those are kind of the power struggles, right? So the flexibility and trying to kind of know, that's kind of the whole part of knowing ourselves and assessing the situation. Like, is so-and-so just doing an annoying behavior that's kind of getting on my nerves, but I can deal with it? Or is so-and-so engaging in a safety risk that I do really need to intervene because now it's jeopardizing his safety? So kind of being flexible with maybe when are we choosing to respond to situations and when are we okay to say, okay, we're just going to let that one go today. Being caring and gentle with our stated expectations. So instead of demanding you do this, that, and the other, being able to come at it from a comfort stance. I need you to use your walking feet when we're in the hallway. Something along those lines instead of stop running, Jeremiah, and addressing it in a way that might have been a little bit more demanding and controlling. Practicing the platinum rule. I'm sure you all have heard about the golden rule before, right? Treat others like you want to be treated. The platinum rule is treat others how they want to be treated. And so really recognizing that everybody comes from a different place, and the way that you want to be treated might be very different than the way somebody else wants to be treated. And so recognizing that when we interact with people, that it's not always what we want, but kind of recognizing that people respond differently to situations. Using humor, I think, can be really helpful. Joking around. I don't know if anybody has teens, middle schoolers, but using humor can be helpful to kind of distract from the situation and help kind of divert attention at times. So being able to be playful, and being playful can also kind of build relationships as well. And then treating the person like a person. They're not just a child. They're a person that has, their own autonomy, and is trying to kind of navigate the world themselves. And we as caregivers are kind of the teachers of that world. So that's some information, a lot of information to kind of think through, right? And there's a plethora more. But as we take a step back, there's some considerations that I would kind of challenge you to think through. This is the time that I would say put on your investigator hat, because as parents, as caregivers, we're always kind of having to dig a little bit deeper and trying to understand behaviors of our children, and especially our kiddos that come from hard backgrounds and kids that have trauma. There's a lot under the surface that we may never know about, right? Like there's things that we'll never have an idea of what our children have gone through. And so taking a step back and recognizing, okay, what's really going on? The tip of the iceberg might be the escalation or the behavior, right? But what's below the surface, right? This is the iceberg analogy. This is another therapeutic tool that we often use as clinicians. So the behaviors are what we see on the surface, but what's the root of the behavior? What's causing the behavior? Which is often like those triggers, maybe those traumatic experiences. And so remembering that the brain has trouble processing when it's escalated, we want to be able to kind of look for the real message that our kids are sending. So that's our best guess, right? It's our guesstimate. So let's say a parent misses a visit and our child now is acting out. We could put on our investigator cap and we could probably deduce that, okay, Johnny's acting out because mom missed the third visit in a row. And so recognizing that, Johnny, are you frustrated that mom missed her visit? So putting words to that, right? So Johnny doesn't have to act out because Johnny can't communicate that. So, as a caregiver, being able to maybe verbalize that for Johnny. And Johnny might say, no, that's not it. I'm not mad about that at all. But you're able to maybe recognize that because you've kind of seen Johnny's behaviors a little bit more to notice every time mom misses a visit, Johnny's behaviors escalate for the next 3 days. Being realistic with our expectations. So I think Mary Bain maybe talked about this too. But with the brain, and knowing that the brain's not always able to process language and communication, our expectation of the way in which our children respond in crisis situations needs to be realistic, right? In a perfect world, our children would always behave. They would always listen to us when we want to lecture. But the brain doesn't work that way, unfortunately, right? So respect towards others. If our children are not giving us eye contact, they might be cursing at us, right? They might not follow directions immediately. They might be talking back. Those are things that potentially have been reinforced over the years that they've learned through other experiences. That has nothing to do with us and the way in which we're trying to respond and interact with them. And being able to put that on the table to say, okay, someday when Johnny's 25, my hope is that I've laid some seeds for Johnny to recognize that in our household, we're respectful towards each other. But in those moments of crisis, that respect, we're just going to put that over here for now, because our job is to help Johnny be safe in that moment and to calm the amygdala, right? So that's kind of, again, that higher order. Like the respect is that higher order that eventually we want to get to. But in the crisis moment, knowing that we can't necessarily teach those new behaviors because the brain doesn't work that way, then we're going to put those higher order behaviors over here, and we're going to really focus on kind of that safety and helping Johnny get through that crisis situation. So that's a lot of information about de-escalation. And I don't imagine everybody's going to kind of keep it all in the brain, right? But the hope is that you're taking away some of these tools, right? You're able to kind of recognize early on when our children are starting to amp up, so that we're intervening early and we're taking a step back and we're recognizing from a trauma-informed lens different approaches and ways in which we can manage for our children. So there's times when we do our best, right? There's times where we've tried all of the skills in the book, and we as clinicians have been here too, where we have done everything possible that we think we can, and our children still reach that boiling point, and they still escalate, and they still engage and maybe potentially problematic or dangerous behaviors. So now we'll kind of jump into that next phase, which is kind of that crisis management phase. So the boiling point, this is what we're kind of calling the crisis. It's the boiling point, right? So when our children are at a calm state, they're probably very lovely. We're getting along well. We're enjoying the day. It's beautiful out. Something might trigger them, and they, you recognize, uh-oh, they're getting a little agitated. You're recognizing those warning signs, and you're starting to kind of provide some of those preventative strategies, those de-escalation strategies, trying to figure out, putting your investigator hat on, what just happened? Like, we were just walking in the park, and it was very beautiful, and now, so-and-so is really frustrated, and I'm confused. What should I do? So we're trying to kind of intervene then. If that's not working and they're continuing to get escalated, we're maybe going to take a little space, walk, take a few steps back. We're going to be very aware of our body language, the way in which we're responding to the child. We're going to keep our interactions kind of limited. We're not going to get into our lecture mode because that's not going to be helpful. This is the time where the brain is starting to kind of shut down and that higher order of functioning. And then all of a sudden, we've done everything we can, and boop, now our child's engaging in that really risky behavior or hitting that boiling point. So again, we're going to kind of keep our distance. We're not going to get in their face because that's not going to help. We're going to try to assess the situation. We're going to remove things away from the person if they're using anything as weapons or anything that could harm themselves. Maybe removing people from the room. And then being very aware of things that might look, sound threatening, might trigger our children if you recognize something specifically that's triggering your child. And then really focusing on safety, right, to kind of maintain and help our children de-stress in that situation. So at the boiling point, the only achievable goal at the boiling point is to get out of the situation without anyone getting hurt. And, that might seem like small potatoes, but the reality is that is the goal. We know the brain. As much as you and I have been guilty of it before too, like have gone into lecture mode when our kids are doing XYZ, that's not going to work. That's not going to be helpful. It's just going to continue to agitate, right? If somebody's talking to you and you're already irritated and they won't stop talking to you, it's just going to continue to increase the agitation. So our number one goal when our child is beyond the escalation point, at this boiling point, engaging in dangerous behaviors, our number one goal is to be safe, right? Is to focus on that safety with our children. Doing our best to kind of manage the situation. Our kids hitting the wall with their head. Maybe we're putting our pillow out against the wall so they're hitting their head on the pillow instead of the wall. Doing what we can to kind of intervene to manage the situation during that time. And I'll tell you, those minutes and sometimes hours can feel like they're lasting forever, right? But with an escalation phase, there is a downside, right? Like you usually have a bell curve of kind of the amping up behaviors, which we're really trying to be preventative. And then you have the escalation burst, right? Which is really usually when it gets pretty bad. And that takes a lot of energy. So, there is going to be a come down where then, the child is going to be maybe a little bit tired and, over that escalation burst. And just as a reminder, we cannot teach at that boiling point moment, right? So we can't put our lecture hats on at that time. We just got to get through the situation. So making safety job number one is really going to be our priority. And to do this, you got to work. Like it's actually a lot of hard work to be able to manage crisis situations. I wish I had an easier answer for everyone because this is often a challenge for all of the families that we work with because it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of energy to think proactively, right? Trying to be one step ahead of our kids and trying to kind of manage and think about like, okay, is Johnny going to run to the road? He usually likes running to the road. So I need to kind of think about where I'm going to place myself in the house to try to help Johnny not run to the road. So trying to kind of think proactively, thinking about a solution, right? And then sometimes being creative. We talked about humor. maybe distracting works really well for your child, and trying to kind of throw in something that can kind of get them off of the escalation. Reassurance instead of reprimanding. So it's not going to be very helpful when we start critiquing and reprimanding our children in the midst of a crisis. So being able to reassure and kind of use comfort statements. So we would encourage comfort statements or need statements. So saying things in less than 5 words, like, I am here for you. It is safe here. You know, you are safe. Can I get you a drink of water? So trying to keep your verbal vocabulary very limited, the brain is able to process those 5 words or less. When you start saying, hey, Johnny, I can see that you're really frustrated right now. Do you want to go outside and take a walk? Or I know there was something over here. The brain can't function. It can't process what you're saying. I just see that you're in my face talking to me, and it's making me really frustrated. So trying to kind of think, okay, what's a comfort statement? What's a need statement? You know, how can my child feel heard and appreciated in a way that, you know, is 5 words or less? And then there's times where we do our best and we try to be preventative and we try to intervene and we do all of the things, and we still might need a higher intervention, right? And so, you know, when do I call the police? When do I call the mobile crisis line? When do I call for backup? Those are really important questions as a household that I would encourage you to think through with each child you have in your home, to kind of have a plan, a crisis prevention plan, to recognize, okay, this is my max, this is my limit, and when I reach this limit, I know I need additional support. And what does that look like? So typically that's when we've exhausted all of those skills and strategies we just talked about for the last 45 minutes. And it can feel like you go through those skills kind of fast at times, but I would encourage that we're always trying to intervene and use our skills to the best of our ability before we're having to maybe call the higher intervention, right? And then also, you might be doing your darndest to use all these skills, and your child's still engaging in really unsafe behaviors, or they're engaging in unsafe behaviors towards you or somebody else in your household. So those are really 2 key areas I would encourage you all as families to kind of recognize and talk through together, like, okay, what's our plan when so-and-so escalates and I can't manage him or her anymore, or they're doing this or they're doing that. And making sure that everybody in the household kind of knows that plan, especially if you have other kiddos, to be able to kind of almost like a fire drill in a sense, right? Like everybody knows to meet by the mailbox out front if it's a fire. Kind of recognizing that too, especially if you have a child in your home that might go through escalation bursts very regularly. So typically in our area, the next line of defense would be typically police intervention. And our community is pushing towards having more accessibility to mobile crisis lines, which will be really great for our community, because right now it's kind of like you all do your best in your home, and some of you might be engaged in more intensive wraparound services like the CAT teams. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the CAT teams, community action teams, that would have like a mobile crisis phone or some other community, I don't know if there's other community programs that have crisis intervention. But mobile crisis is basically like your 911 for mental health emergencies. And so I think they're rolling that out in July, where families will be able to use this phone number instead of 911 to respond to mental health emergencies, which will be coming at situations with a much more trauma-informed lens than sometimes, you know, maybe the police or just children's experience with the police might not always be positive based upon their histories. So for us, this situation would look like potentially calling the police. And so the process that we have in Florida goes through a process called Baker Acts. So I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with a Baker Act. So a Baker Act, there's a few different types of Baker Acts, but typically a clinician, a licensed clinician, psychologist, doctor, can write a Baker Act form, which is basically an involuntary psychiatric hospitalization for that person. And the hospital that the person goes to would have 72 hours to examine that person and determine their stability, right? So typically, most people would go into a hospitalization if they're under a Baker Act, would stay typically for 72 hours. And the whole goal of the Baker Act is stabilization, right? So you're going in at a very escalated point, and the goal of the hospitalization would be that you're going out of the hospital stable and safe. And so some people are there longer than 3 days, but most would be there for at least 72 hours. These are the 3 inpatient psychiatric facilities we have in our area. Bayside would typically be the receiving facility for Sarasota County. It's the only one we have in Sarasota County. And so what happens when an officer would come to the home is that they would typically transport that individual to the closest receiving facility. So if you're in Sarasota County, that's going to be Bayside. If you're in Manatee County, it's going to be either Suncoast, which is out kind of west Bradenton, 51st Street, or it's going to be Centerstone, which is a little bit more east, closer to 75 off 64, closer to that area. And then if you're in DeSoto, I'm guessing it would probably be Bayside. Charlotte, actually, yeah, it might be closer. Yeah, so these are kind of your 3 inpatient psychiatric hospitals in our area. We would, recommend, if you know your child or you know your children in your home, if your child is able to voluntarily say, yes, I want to go to the hospital, that would be the recommended route to take. If for some reason they're saying and verbalizing to you, I don't think I can stay safe tonight, I need more support, and you know your child and you feel safe transporting your child to the hospital, that would be, I think, the first route we would recommend. Now, obviously, when it gets to that point, it's not always possible, and so that's where we sometimes need a higher level of intervention to ensure the safety of our children. There's been times where I've had kids in my car trying to jump out of my car. So I think you just really kind of need to know what you feel safe with, and kind of knowing your child too, and knowing, am I going to be able to transport my child safely? Typically when it gets to that boiling point, that escalation, having the police involved, to be able to help transport can be helpful. And I've had some really good interactions with our police where they've kind of talked through and tried to process with the child before they get into the police vehicle to then transport them to the hospital. Anybody have questions about Baker Acts? I know that can sometimes be a bit intense, but it is a resource in our community that's definitely available and out there. And Suncoast actually just transitioned. They originally were both adult and child, and they've shifted all of their services to just child and adolescent. So they actually now have 40 inpatient beds, whereas Bayside and Centerstone, I believe, would have between 15 to 20, I think. And so if for some reason a facility was full when your child was sent to the facility, it's the facility's responsibility to ensure your child has a bed. So whether they continue to stay at Centerstone or if Centerstone's full, it's Centerstone's responsibility to ensure that they're transported to the next closest receiving facility. So again, with that being said, if your child is Baker Acted, if your child is engaging in these escalating behaviors, if your de-escalation and crisis management strategies aren't working, or you're having to engage in these big behaviors on a weekly basis, we would strongly encourage your child and yourself as a caregiver participate in trauma-informed assessment and trauma-informed evidence-based practices. So those are practices and clinical services that are scientifically based. So you've heard us maybe talk a little bit more about science tonight. Science is research-based, and so we have a number of therapy modalities that have years upon years of clinical evidence and research behind them to say that this therapy model is effective with this population. And so each population that I'm sure you've even encountered in your own households, there would be a specific clinical intervention for those children. And when we're talking about the kiddos that you all are working with some of the trauma that they've experienced, there's very specific trauma-informed approaches in working with children and helping you all as caregivers navigate those systems and what that looks like. And so that includes a comprehensive trauma assessment. If we're not screening for trauma, then we're not going to see trauma, right? And so Mary Bain mentioned, some of our kiddos will come into our homes maybe with an ADHD diagnosis or a disruptive mood dysregulation diagnosis, which could be valid, but it also could be the underlying pinnings of trauma that's been misdiagnosed. So if I see somebody in our clinical office that has a diagnosis of ADHD, I'm going to treat that person very differently than I'm going to treat somebody who has a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. So it's just like a medical diagnosis, right? If you come in with kidney disease, I'm going to treat the kidney disease when really, let's say you had something going on with your heart. It's not going to help the situation. And the same goes for clinical care. So you want to make sure that your children are getting a trauma-informed assessment. And then also engagement with you all, right? So you all as foster parents and adoptive parents should have a really strong participation and engagement in clinical services. Anybody that is a child or adolescent should always have a caregiver present with them, not throughout the whole session, but involved in clinical treatment and understanding, what is my child working through? How can I support them as a caregiver? What do I need to look at? What do I need to be prepared for? Most of our clinical interventions that are trauma focused will have, a trauma narrative or a really strong caregiver component that's going to be important for you to be a part of. And then, like we said, obviously being very trauma focused if we're treating children that come from trauma backgrounds. So that's so much information. I'm sorry I talked a lot to you tonight. But there's a lot that's going on, right? There's a lot that's going on in our children's brains, and there's a lot for us to kind of be ready for and be prepared for when we're interacting with our children. And, one of the goals and the takeaways that I want you all to be able to recognize in here tonight too is that there's a lot of areas where we can intervene and help situations before they hit that boiling point, before they hit that escalation. There's a lot of hope overall. And I think one thing to kind of take away as well is that the brain is very plastic in the sense that, we can create these new neuropathways. It doesn't mean that since our child went through XYZ, they're predestined to live this life of horribleness in the future. No, that's not the case, right? And you all in your relationships with your children, we recognize and we know that healing from trauma comes through relationships and the way that we interact and respond to our children. So the jobs that you all are doing at home are the most important jobs ever, right, for our children, to be able to kind of heal and to kind of be able to bounce back from a lot of that adversity that they've experienced throughout their life. So with that being said, we are done for the evening, and I don't know what time it is, but we're happy to help answer any questions that you all may have as well, or pass it over to Jody. Yes. So if I'm hearing you correctly, so I'm hearing you say that you're kind of rethinking some of the ways in which you're responding to children in your home with consequences and how to respond to situations with consequences and what should you do with that approach if it's kind of more of the comfort versus control kind of approach. Is that, if I'm hearing you? Okay. Do you want to take? Do you want me to take?
Yeah. We'll take turns. Consequences can be very good things. You don't want to give up consequences. You want to make sure the child knows beforehand what the consequences will be so that there are no surprises. That's the safety. You want to make sure that when you're giving a consequence, you do so in a non-angry manner. You're not going to shout, okay, you can't have your iPad for 3 days or whatever. Just say, Bobby, this is the consequence. And you just enact that consequence without a lot of discussion. But you always want to do the same thing every time. That's safety also. And so you don't want to be in their face giving a consequence. You think about the distance that we were talking about. But absolutely don't give up your consequences. The things to remember, so many of the points that we made tonight are what to do as situations start to go south. You're going to live with consequences in day-to-day activities. But as things start to get difficult, that's when you want to go to de-escalation, and then if you have to crisis management. And really, you could probably practice de-escalation every day, even at work, with your significant other, whatever. It's a great way to avoid things going beyond where they need to go. But consequences are still good. It's how you do it and how much they understand about it.
Yeah, and I would reference to kind of that thermometer that we talked through as well. If we're giving consequences at the boiling point, then it's going to be really challenging for anything to kind of get through, right? For our child to really understand the purpose behind the consequence or what's even happening, right? So in those situations, you know, like Mary Bain said, if we can lay the groundwork and kind of help our children understand, you know, these are behaviors that are going to be consequence and are not tolerated in our home. And then let's say our child's engaging in that behavior and they're really escalated. Well, we're going to focus during that situation on kind of the safety and trying to help our child calm the amygdala and get back to a safe state. And then when they're at that safe state, then that's when you're going back and debriefing. And we're going to give that consequence too, to be able to say, you know, I understand you were really frustrated. In our home, we practice safe hands. So we're going to do X, Y, Z as kind of whatever the consequence might be. So the child recognizes when they're in a learning state that the behavior they engaged in was not an appropriate behavior. And there are consequences for inappropriate behaviors. Yeah, but it's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right, sure, yeah. If you want to practice modeling to be able to kind of walk back through that and say, yes, this would be an appropriate response. Yeah, that's kind of your TBRI popping in, right? Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
Thank you both very much. And I love that you ended with that hope piece, you know, like, so all of that all that wiring that already happened, all of that trauma, and then to kind of summarize it to say, we're not without hope, you know, like the message here is the science is what it is. And it's our job to help with that rewiring and that reshaping. And as believers, we believe that God is ultimately in control of our children's futures and that He's entrusted us with a great opportunity to reshape and rewire the brain. And we lean into science to know how to do that. And we trust Him that He's going to help guide us in that process. And so it was a bit of a heavier topic tonight. But that was really birthed out of having so many conversations with families in our community right now that are struggling with really heavy things. And so we don't want you to come here and think, oh, we're going to talk about irrelevant topics. Like we want to meet you where you're at with your family. And so along those lines, we're filling out what the rest of the topics are going to look like for 2022. And so if we need more of just the not so fun, but this is what's happening in our house, yeah, not that you're not fun. I'm sure you're very lovely people to spend time with, but that was kind of a downer in a lot of ways, you know, because these are hard things to talk about. But at the same time, we do have hope, and we do have a lot of great resources, and we have things that we know to do to be able to help our kids. So along those lines, I know that there are families that have really struggled with, like, when do I make that decision? Like, are we at a Baker Act level here? Like, is this what it looks like? And that seems like a scary thing to do. And I think one of the reasons that we're given community is to be able to lean into each other too. And so if that is a conversation that your family has started to have, or you've started to wonder some of those things, feel free to talk to me after too. I think I can connect you with some people who may help you work through. Sometimes just getting on the phone with somebody and saying, this is what's going on in our house, and does that sound Have you experienced that, and what did you do, and how did you know when to make that call? That can be helpful as well. If you guys don't mind, during this session, I did send you all just kind of a recap email. And if you have a moment to open that, there's a 3-question survey. It helps us just to know, are we teaching the right things? Is it helpful to you? Do you have suggestions? It'll just take, a couple of seconds to complete that, but we love getting your feedback. Also, if you have a certificate to pick up, those are going to be right out that door on the table where you signed in. Just a reminder, we have all of these lovely toys that we would love to send home with you. And then there are also, there's food, and there's to-go meals, and there's leftovers from tonight. And so that is all for you to take home. You don't have to pack lunch tomorrow because we've got it taken care of for you. And then last of all, 2 more things, sorry. If you have your little water bottle caps, we have a preschool teacher in the audience tonight, and she would just really love for you to just put your cap on the table and leave it there for her. She's going to use those for a project with her preschoolers. And then if you have kiddos that you dropped off tonight, if you would just make sure to, please take them home. We have amazing, amazing volunteers who give up their time every month to be with our kids. And so we just ask that you pick them up in a timely manner. Scooch on over there in the next couple minutes. So thanks for being with us tonight, and we hope to see you next month.